The photograph had already passed through the hands of experienced military analysts, examined, logged, and set aside as unremarkable. Nothing about it seemed to warrant a second look. It took one woman studying it again, weeks later, to notice a single shadow that fell at an angle nothing else in the frame could explain, and that shadow led directly to one of the most dangerous weapons programs of the Second World War. This is the story of the Allied photographic interpreters, the women who spent the war analyzing millions of feet of aerial reconnaissance film frame by frame, and the specific analytical breakthrough that identified Nazi Germany's secret rocket and flying bomb development site at Peenemünde before either weapon ever reached London. Photographic interpretation during the Second World War was a discipline built entirely on the ability to extract meaning from ambiguity. Reconnaissance aircraft flew missions over occupied Europe, photographing suspected military installations, industrial sites, and coastal defenses, returning with thousands of feet of film that had to be examined, catalogued, and cross-referenced against previous imagery to identify anything that had changed. The work required interpreters to develop an almost forensic sensitivity to detail, comparing photographs taken weeks or months apart to notice new construction, altered terrain, or equipment that had not been present before. Most of what appeared in any given photograph was mundane: farmland, forest, existing roads, buildings already catalogued in previous passes. The skill of interpretation was not simply looking at a photograph, it was knowing, based on accumulated pattern recognition across thousands of prior images, precisely what in a given frame did not belong. Central Interpretation Unit at RAF Medmenham became the hub of this work for the Royal Air Force, staffed substantially by women serving in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, alongside American photo interpreters who trained and worked alongside them as Allied intelligence cooperation deepened through the middle years of the war. The unit received reconnaissance photography from missions flown across occupied Europe, and interpreters worked in shifts examining film through stereoscopic viewers that created a three-dimensional effect from paired photographs, allowing trained analysts to judge height, depth, and scale in ways a flat photograph could not reveal on its own. This stereoscopic technique became essential to identifying military construction that had been deliberately camouflaged or built to resemble civilian structures from a single angle. By 1943, British intelligence had accumulated growing but fragmentary evidence suggesting Germany was developing long-range weapons capable of striking London and other British cities without requiring an aircraft or pilot. Intercepted communications referenced testing activity at a location on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde, but the specific nature of what was being developed there remained unclear. Reconnaissance missions were flown over the site, and the resulting photographs were distributed to Central Interpretation Unit for analysis alongside the enormous volume of other reconnaissance material arriving daily from across the European theater. Initial analysis of the Peenemünde photographs identified construction activity and unusual site development, but did not immediately reveal the specific purpose of what was being built there. The photographs were reviewed, catalogued, and set aside without conclusive findings, one data point among thousands competing for interpreter attention across an intelligence apparatus tracking military activity across an entire continent. It was Constance Babington Smith, a photographic interpreter working within the unit, who returned to earlier Peenemünde imagery and identified the detail that had gone unnoticed through previous analysis passes. Examining photographs of the site with the specific hypothesis that Germany might be developing pilotless aircraft rather than only conventional rocket technology, she identified small cruciform-shaped objects near the site's test facilities. The objects themselves were small enough and positioned within a frame containing substantial other construction activity that earlier analysis had not flagged them as significant. What made the identification possible was not simply spotting an object in a photograph. It required understanding what shadow length and angle a small aircraft-shaped object should cast given the sun's position at the time the photograph was taken, and recognizing that the shadow pattern visible in the image was consistent with a winged object of a specific approximate size, rather than any of the more mundane possibilities the shape might otherwise have suggested at a casual glance. This kind of analysis depended on technical knowledge that extended well beyond simply having sharp eyesight or patience. Interpreters using stereoscopic viewing had to understand the relationship between an object's height, the sun's angle at the time of photography, and the resulting shadow length that a given object should logically produce. A shadow that appeared too long or too short for an object's apparent size indicated something about that object's true height or shape that contradicted an initial more casual reading of the image. Babington Smith's identification of the cruciform objects at Peenemünde rested on exactly this kind of calculation, recognizing that the shadow behavior visible in the photograph was inconsistent with the object being anything other than a small, winged aircraft positioned on the ground, awaiting testing. The identification prompted immediate follow-up analysis and additional reconnaissance missions specifically targeting the site to gather clearer imagery. Subsequent photographs confirmed the presence of what would eventually be identified as the V-1 flying bomb, an unmanned aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine carrying an explosive warhead and designed to be launched from ramps toward British cities, without any pilot aboard. The same broader intelligence effort at Peenemünde also eventually confirmed the development of the V-2, a ballistic rocket representing an entirely different and more advanced weapons technology, though the V-1 identification came first and depended specifically on the shadow analysis technique that had gone unused in earlier examination passes of the same photographic material. The practical consequences of this identification were immediate and significant. Once Allied intelligence understood that Germany was actively developing an unmanned flying bomb capable of being launched at British cities, military planners were able to begin developing countermeasures before the weapon entered operational use. This included identifying and targeting launch ramp construction along the French coast, which reconnaissance photography subsequently revealed being built in significant numbers, allowing Allied bombing campaigns to specifically target this infrastructure months before the V-1 offensive against London actually began in June 1944. Without the earlier identification of the weapon's existence and general design at Peenemünde, this proactive targeting of launch infrastructure would not have been possible, and Britain would have faced the V-1 offensive with substantially less warning and no established framework for identifying what the launch sites being observed along the French coast were actually for. The technical demands of photographic interpretation work extended well beyond this single, well-documented case. Interpreters at Medmenham and similar Allied facilities analyzed staggering volumes of material throughout the war, developing specialized expertise in identifying camouflaged installations, tracking naval vessel movements through subtle wake patterns visible in aerial photography, and monitoring industrial production by observing changes in factory complexes over successive reconnaissance passes. This required interpreters to build extensive personal knowledge of what normal military and industrial activity looked like across dozens of site types, so that deviations from that baseline pattern would register as significant rather than being dismissed as unremarkable variation. The work demanded sustained visual concentration across enormous volumes of largely uneventful material, punctuated by moments where a single correctly identified detail carried consequences far beyond the individual photograph being examined. What makes the Peenemünde identification particularly notable within this broader context is how directly it illustrates the value of returning to previously analyzed material with a specific, informed hypothesis, rather than treating an initial review as conclusive. The photographs that ultimately revealed the V1 test site had already been examined by other analysts without producing the same conclusion. The difference was not access to better photographic equipment or higher resolution imagery. It was analytical persistence combined with a specific technical understanding of shadow geometry that allowed a second pass through familiar material to extract a conclusion the first pass had missed entirely. Intelligence work of this kind rarely produced dramatic, single-moment breakthroughs visible to anyone glancing at the same material. It depended on trained analysts willing to revisit assumptions and apply increasingly specific technical reasoning to photographs that had already been logged and set aside as unremarkable. The identification of German V-weapon development at Peenemünde stands as one of the most consequential intelligence findings of the European Air War, directly shaping Allied bombing priorities and providing critical advance warning before the V1 offensive against London began. It was made possible not through any single dramatic reconnaissance mission or extraordinary piece of luck, but through the patient, technically rigorous work of a photographic interpreter applying a specific hypothesis about shadow geometry to imagery that had already passed through other hands without yielding the same conclusion. The interpreters at Medmenham operated largely outside public recognition throughout the war and for decades afterward, their work classified and their names absent from the wartime narratives that instead centered on pilots, generals, and the machinery of combat itself, even though the intelligence they extracted from still photographs shaped decisions made at the highest levels of Allied military planning. Every dusty page still hides a name history forgot to remember. Follow Iron Women archives, and let's keep prying those pages open, one forgotten woman at a time.